Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's discussion. In today's discussion, we're continuing with our ongoing program entitled The Precedential Cases, and these are the medical legal game-changing cases that changed everything as we know it regarding our qualified medical evaluations. And in session 1 of this program, we talked about the importance of the Escobedo decision and its relevance to your apportionment determination primarily, but also its importance and relevance to every single opinion and conclusion that you offer throughout the entirety of your QME report. And in session 2, we built upon the concepts of substantial medical evidence as described in Escobedo, and we transitioned those ideas into a different set of ideas having to do with the Alvarez and Guzman decisions and providing for alternative impairment ratings which have the substantial effect of doubling, tripling, and quadrupling the examinee's permanent impairment ratings. And we combined the concepts contained within the Escobedo decision and the Alvarez and Guzman's decisions and talked about how, if you're going to provide for higher and alternative impairment ratings, how to qualify those opinions as substantial medical evidence according to the dictates of the Escobedo decision, so that your opinion and conclusion on a higher alternative impairment rating will be upheld by the parties. So that was a very powerful set of discussions. Now, in today's session, we're going to build even further on our first 2 sessions, and we're going to talk about how some qualified medical evaluators take their permanent impairment ratings over the top, and when I say over the top, I mean even exceeding 100% impairment ratings by using a very clever and creative alternative impairment rating based upon the Kite decision. And the Kite decision had to do with how multiple impairments, especially when considering multiple impairments of multiple body regions, how those impairments can be totaled up to create a sum total and final permanent impairment rating. And the Kite decision paved the way and created the precedent for totaling the impairments by simple addition of the impairments rather than by the method that's described under the schedule, which is the law, which is based upon the AMA guides. The schedule dictates that impairments are totaled and summed according to the use of the combined values chart on pages 604 and 605 of the AMA guides. Well, the Kite decision created a precedent whereby permanent impairments can be summed and totaled in any way that the qualified medical evaluator so determines to be the most accurate summing and totaling. And in the Kite decision, the qualified medical evaluator simply used simple addition versus the use of the combined values chart to sum and total the various impairments associated with Mr. Kite's industrial injury. Now, this is important because you're going to be receiving cover letters from applicant attorneys especially, demanding that you give a consideration to adding the impairments versus combining the impairments through the use of the combined values chart. And I have to say, in some circumstances, and we'll talk about these in great length in today's discussion, in some circumstances, it does make sense to add the impairments versus combine the impairments through the combined values chart. So as you may or may not know, the combined values chart has a compressive effect when totaling and summing multiple impairments. So for example, if you have an examinee that has an impairment of the cervical spine, an impairment of the right shoulder, and an impairment of, let's say, the lumbar spine, when you sum and total and combine these impairments through the use of the combined values chart, the final resulting permanent impairment rating is less than the permanent impairment rating that would be achieved simply by adding the impairment. So for example, an examinee who has a 10% impairment of the cervical spine, a 10% impairment of the right shoulder, and a 10% impairment of the lumbar spine would combine through the use of the combined values chart to 27% whole person impairment versus 30% whole person impairment, which would be the resulting sum if you simply added the 10 plus 10 plus 10 impairments. So through adding the impairments versus combining the impairments, the impairment ratings escapes the compressive effect of the combined values chart. Now, this is typically not a big deal when you're talking about 2 and 3 and 5 and 8% impairments. However, even in low impairment ratings, when the impairment rating is adjusted by the disability evaluation unit for age and occupation to come up with a final permanent disability rating, in other words, converting our permanent impairment rating into a permanent disability rating down at the disability evaluation unit, the effect can be substantial. Even a 1% difference in impairment rating can result in a many percent difference in a permanent disability rating. And this becomes even more profound as the permanent impairment ratings start to exceed 50%. 50%. When we exceed 50% permanent impairment ratings and we're combining multiple impairment ratings from multiple body regions, the permanent impairment ratings through the combined values chart become increasingly compressive and asymptotic, if you remember that term from algebra, asymptotic to 100%. In other words, with the combined values chart, it becomes increasingly impossible to approach a 100% permanent impairment rating. In fact, even Christopher Reeves, you remember Christopher Reeves, even Christopher Reeves would not qualify for a 100% permanent impairment rating. He would only rate at some point in the 80%. Well, with adding the impairments versus combining the impairments through the use of the combined values chart, it becomes very easy to have examinees qualify for 100% total disability when the impairments are added and when they escape the compressive effect of the combined values chart. So the Kite case created a precedent for huge impairment ratings, and when you combine the capacity to add permanent impairments versus combining them through the use of the combined values chart, when you add that on top of alternative permanent impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman, it's easy to see that the entire philosophy of Senate Bill 899, which has as its intent to reduce skyrocketing workers' compensation costs, with these cases, with the Alvarez and Guzman case and the Kite case now, permanent impairment ratings have exploded through the roof, thereby thwarting the original intent of Senate Bill 899. So let me just give you an example of that. Imagine you have an examinee who has a cervical spine impairment of, say, 5% under the DRE Category 2 for 5% whole person impairment, but by using an alternative impairment rating within the four corners of the AMA guides, that examinee can be rated under Chapter 13 as a paroxysmal disorder at 13% whole person impairment. So we went from 5% to 13% using an alternative impairment rating. Then imagine that the examinee, and let me just grab some notes on this, imagine that the examinee also has a permanent impairment rating for the shoulder, which rates only 3% under the AMA guides, but under Chapter 13, which can be rated for 39% whole person impairment due to analogy to chronic pain, we've taken the permanent impairment rating from 3% to 39%, an increase in 13 times the permanent impairment rating. So the cervical spine rating went from 5 to 13. The shoulder impairment rating went from 3% to 39%. And then imagine that the examinee has a lumbar spine impairment of 5% whole person under the strict application of the guides, but using an alternative impairment rating within the four corners of the AMA guides, the examinee qualifies for 19% whole person impairment by analogy to hernia, qualifies for 35% whole person impairment by analogy to gait derangement. And then because examinees with hernia and gait derangement do not have pain, you can add an additional 3% impairment for pain. So this examinee qualifies for 55% whole person impairment, an increase of 11-fold of the permanent impairment rating. And these are all actual cases that I'm quoting you. So the cervical spine impairment, which was 5%, the shoulder impairment, which was 3%, and the lumbar spine impairment, which was 5%, which if combined using the combined values chart, would qualify for 13% total whole person impairment, but through using alternative impairment ratings would qualify for 55% whole person impairment. That's 14% plus 39% plus 19% plus 35% plus 3% for pain. Under the strict application of the AMA guides, those impairments would be combined using the combined values chart. This would combine to 55% whole person impairment. Okay, went from 13% impairment to 55% whole person impairment, but if instead of combining those impairments under the combined values chart, you then choose to add those impairments based upon a synergistic effect as described in the Kite decision, this examinee then comes in at 110% impairment rating. This is an examinee who would then qualify for a 100% disability rating. And so this is an example of how the combined effect of the Alvarez and Guzman decisions combined with the ability to add impairments versus combine impairments under the Kite decision can dramatically impact your permanent impairment ratings. So in today's discussion, I want to review with you in depth 3 cases that employ adding versus combining impairments so that you can see how this may apply to your very next examinee. Okay? So with no further ado, let's begin today's discussion regarding adding versus combining impairments. Okay, the cases that I want to share with you today include the Kite versus East Bay Municipality Utility District, the LeCount versus Los Angeles County case, and the Miller versus Stroer and Graff case. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to today's discussion because it seems that applicant attorneys are referencing these cases more and more in their cover letters to us as qualified medical evaluators. And the philosophy is that applicant attorneys want to preempt us and precondition us to consider adding the permanent impairments versus combining the permanent impairments. So they reference these cases to sort of put the idea in our head that in the case that the examinee should end up with permanent impairment, they want to share with us the precedent-setting cases wherein the impairments have been successfully added, which then makes a significant difference in the lives of the examinee and then also, of course, in the lives of the applicant attorney. So you're going to see these names referenced in your cover letters. You're going to see specifically the Kite versus East Bay Municipality District. You may also see the LeCount case. And then with lesser frequency, it seems the attorneys are referring also to the Miller and versus Stroer and Graff case, but to a lesser frequency than these first 2 cases. So as an example, I want to read to you several passages from a recent cover letter that I received from an applicant attorney. And this cover letter came, as expected, immediately after the issuance of the QME report. So in the QME report, I provided a permanent impairment rating of 3 regions of the body, of the cervical spine, of the lumbar spine, and of the shoulder. So this fits our criteria of multiple impairments of multiple body regions. And just as a reflex, the applicant attorney issued this follow-up letter and this follow-up request for supplemental report. She states that you will recall that you evaluated my client in your capacity as the panel QME and issued your most recent report on 11/13/18. You provided ratings of 5% for the cervical spine, 5% for the lumbar spine, and 8% for the shoulder. And then she goes into the philosophy of adding versus combining multiple impairments. She states, as you know, we would normally combine disabilities to multiple body parts using the combined values chart. The combined values chart has a compressive effect. Thus, for instance, the unadjusted value of all of Mrs. Jones' ratings, if combined using the combined value chart, would equal 17%, whereas if they were added, they would equal 18%. So 17% is what results when you combine impairments of 5% with 5% with 8%. You can see 5 plus 5 plus 8 is 18, but the combined values chart has a compressive effect in this case of 1% whole person impairment. Now you might think to yourself, well, what in the world? What is all this trouble about 1% whole person impairment? Well, the applicant attorney tells us that this 1% discrepancy is even greater after the disability evaluation unit takes this 17% and adjusts that for age and occupation to come up with the final permanent disability rating. The difference is greater than just 1% when using 17% as the impairment rating compared to using 18% for the impairment rating. So even 1% difference can make a big difference to the examinee as well as to the applicant attorney. She goes on and says we're not obligated to use the combined values chart in all cases. If it makes more sense to simply add the various body part disabilities. And this was explained in the cases of Kite, LeCount, and Miller. And we're going to go over those cases. She says, in this case, since there are multiple body parts injured, and since Mrs. Jones cannot effectively favor one body part over the other, for instance, by altering the way she lifts things, do you feel that the various disabilities should be added to avoid the compressive effect in order to better represent the injured worker's level of disability? Another way of asking this would be, if the injured worker has 5% cervical spine injury, it should say impairment, why would that be worth any less just because he or she also has a lumbar spine injury or a shoulder injury? In fact, between the different body parts, there may even be a synergistic effect requiring a multiplier effect to fairly represent the impairment. So the philosophy of adding the impairments versus combining the impairments is that impairment of one body region can contribute to impairment in another body region. And in this example, she gives an example of lifting activities. So for example, with lifting activities, lifting involves the lumbar spine. We know that, okay? Lifting also involves the upper extremities and the shoulder. We know that. Well, imagine a person, an examinee, who has an impairment of the lumbar spine that affects lifting. Let's say this examinee goes to lift an object from the level of the floor with an impaired lumbar spine. Well, because the lumbar spine is impaired, this examinee is going to compensate for the lumbar spine impairment by employing more upper extremity activity in the lifting of the objects. Well, if the upper extremity, specifically the shoulder itself, is in addition impaired, then the shoulder is not able to compensate for the impairment of the lumbar spine, and therefore the impairment of the shoulder contributes to the impairment of the lumbar spine. And this contributory effect or synergistic effect of multiple impairments on each other is not accounted for when the permanent impairment ratings are combined
which is a compressive effect, which is a reduction effect, compared to when the permanent impairment ratings are simply added. Okay? So that's the philosophy of adding impairments when you have multiple impairments of multiple body parts and or regions. So in this cover letter, she continues, and she really drives the point home by giving an analysis of both the Kite and LeCount cases. And here, I believe she's specifically referencing the LeCount case. So she says, normally the disability evaluation unit combines disabilities to multiple body parts using the combined values chart. But the combined values chart has a compressive effect. Thus, for instance, 10 plus 10 plus 10 would only equal 27 using the combined values chart. Now here, in referencing the LeCount case, LeCount, I'll just tell you, he was declared to be 100% permanently disabled based on his permanent impairment ratings, and also under Labor Code 4662, which provides for 100% permanent disability based upon the facts. So here she's referencing facts, and she says part of the facts that are referenced in Labor Code 4662 includes the use of the combined values chart versus adding the impairments. Normally the WCAB combines disabilities, whereas 10 plus 10 plus 10 would only equal 27 using the combined values chart, which is a loss of 3%. This compression is greater once you pass 50%. So for example, 50 plus 50 would equal 75 with a loss of 25%. As another example, 90 plus 50 will only equal 95 with a loss of 45%. In fact, as you get into the higher and higher permanent impairment values, it becomes more and more impossible to approach 100% impairment through the use of the combined values chart. And that was one of the issues under contention in the LeCount case. So she tells us that we're not obligated to use the combined values chart in all cases if it makes more sense to simply add the various body part disabilities. Okay? So in the LeCount case, it was found that by adding the permanent impairments, Mr. LeCount had 120 to 150% impairment. But under the combined values chart, his impairment ratings only came in at 80 or 90%. Well, the parties argued that Mr. LeCount was 100% permanently disabled, both on the facts of the greater than 100% permanent impairment rating through adding the impairments, but also under Labor Code 4662, which provides for 100% permanent total disability based on the facts, and they felt that the facts supported the use of adding versus combining the impairments. A very fascinating case, and we'll go more into that here in just a few minutes. And then here she makes her final point by describing what she refers to as synergistic issues. Now, this word synergistic is going to be a key word to use if you're going to find that your permanent impairment rating is more accurately described by adding impairments than combining impairments. And the word synergistic is what was used in the Kite case, which was the first case to successfully add impairments compared to combining impairments. So with regards to synergistic issues, she tells us it is not only counterintuitive to assume that if you have two disabilities or impairments that it is less disabling, it also runs counter to empirical evidence. Numerous medical studies published in peer-reviewed journals have documented that where there is both a mental and a physical impairment, the combination of the two generally cause increased disability that is greater than the simple sum of its parts rather than a lesser disability. The combined values chart is designed to deal with overlap, but in an impairment rating, what is the overlap between an orthopedic impairment and an internal impairment or a psychiatric impairment? She makes a point and she says, why, if I have a 25% orthopedic impairment, should that make a 20% psychiatric impairment any less than 20%, which is what would happen if you use the combined values chart? Isn't the true impairment the sum of the orthopedic impairment and the psychiatric impairment? So this is a very compelling idea and a very compelling concept and issue. It may be, and you may agree with me, that when we're dealing with multiple impairments within the same body region, such as the shoulder, for example, loss of range of motion, loss of strength, and resection of the distal clavicle, it may be in those cases that the use of the combined values chart is essential to eliminate the overlap between those impairments within the same body region. But the point that the applicant attorney here is making is that when you have multiple impairments of multiple body regions, where is the overlap? What is the overlap? More commonly than not is what she's arguing, I should say. More commonly than not, there's not only not overlap, but there's actually synergistic contribution of one impairment to the other. And if that's actually true, and if that's actually the case, then her argument is that those impairment ratings should be added rather than combined. So she finishes up her cover letter with a simple question. And that question is, in this case, if there are multiple body parts injured, do you feel that due to synergies or other reasons, the various disabilities should be added to avoid the compressive effect in order to better represent the injured worker's level of disability? And if you do believe that, please explain to us why you believe that. So you may not be completely convinced that you believe this concept just yet. So let's talk about a couple of cases where this concept was successfully employed. Okay, so let's talk about the Kite versus East Bay Municipal Utility District. And you're going to see this case referenced over and over and over again, either in the cover letters that you receive or in requests for supplemental reports, because this was the case that seemingly started it all when it comes to adding versus combining impairments. Well, Kite suffered injury to both hips. He had replacement of one hip and then had replacement of the other hip approximately 2 years later. And when he was declared to be permanent and stationary, the QME provided for 20% impairment of each hip, because each hip had undergone hip replacement, and the permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides simply has to do with the results of the hip replacement. So both hips rated at 20%. Well, the QME added versus combined the impairments to each hip for a total of 40% whole person impairment. And using the combined values chart, the final impairment rating probably would have been somewhat closer to 36%, maybe 35%. But because of the compressive effect, and because each of these impairment ratings are fairly high at 20%, there would have been a substantial compressive effect of these impairment ratings. But he added them to total 40% whole person impairment. Well, the defendant sought reconsideration on the substantiability of adding the impairments versus combining the impairments. The defendant did not have any objection to the 20% for each hip impairment rating. The objection was that the impairment ratings should be combined according to the scheduled rating from the AMA guides, versus the alternative rating under Alvarez and Guzman of adding the impairments. Well, the WCAB upheld the alternative rating, which allowed for adding versus combining the impairments. So let's see what the judges had to say about this. Well, the judges took a hard look at the qualified medical evaluator's reasoning for adding the impairments compared to combining the impairments, and they reviewed his reports wherein he stated, I do find that there is a synergistic effect of the injury to the same body parts bilaterally versus body parts from different regions of the body. So in this case, we had the same body part, which was the hip, bilaterally versus body parts from different regions of the body, say, for example, a wrist and maybe the lumbar spine. He says, in this case, it is my opinion that the best way to combine the impairments to the right and left hips would be to add them versus using the combined values chart, which would result in a lower whole person impairment. Well, the case came on for trial over the extent of permanent disability and whether defendants' tardy return to work offer. That's not the part of our discussion here. The judge says, I found the QME's reasoning in favoring synergy over reduced combined disability to be persuasive, and I awarded the disability that he recommended. So here, the judge found the qualified medical evaluator's reasoning to be compelling. And let's talk about what that was based upon. And here's where the qualified medical evaluator established the precedent-setting thinking that now contributes to the philosophy of combining impairments versus adding impairments, or I should say adding impairments versus combining the impairments. The judge stated that when turning to the QME's determination that simple addition of applicant's left and right hip impairment provides a more accurate description of his overall impairment than application of the reduction formula under the combined values chart, the opinion of the qualified medical evaluator was that there is a synergistic effect of one hip injury upon the opposite hip injury. To this, the judge says, I agree. He says, it appears logical that a person who is able to compensate through the opposite member for an injury to one limb is to some extent less disabled or less impaired than someone who cannot so compensate. So in this case, because the examinee had bilateral hip impairments, there's no way for one hip to compensate for the other impaired hip. If you have an impairment of your left hip, naturally you're going to compensate with the right hip, and the right hip is going to bear more weight and it's going to employ more movement than the impaired opposite hip. And so the unimpaired hip picks up the slack or compensates for the impaired hip. Well, that compensatory relief is absent when the opposite member is similarly impaired. So in this region, for this reasoning, the one impairment has a synergistic or contributory impact to the other impairment, and for that reason, the qualified medical evaluator opined that the impairment should be added versus combined. And the judge says, I remain persuaded that the QME has appropriately determined that the impairment resulting from applicant's left and right hip injuries is most accurately combined using simple addition than by use of the combined values formula. So what's important about this case is that it involved bilateral same body parts. So this is an example of when you can employ adding impairments compared to combining impairments is when you have same body part injured bilaterally. As we're going to see, it also works and also can be employed when you have multiple impairments of multiple and different body regions, which we will see in our very next case, which is the LeCount case. So with the LeCount case, LeCount suffered injury to multiple body parts, including the neck, the back, the left shoulder, the left wrist, the right hip, the psyche, the GI system, and also in the form of diabetes, hypertension, and sleep disorder. So this is multiple body parts, multiple body systems, and multiple body regions. Well, LeCount went through evaluations by 3 AMEs. One was an orthopedic AME, one was a psychiatric AME, one was an internal medicine AME, and also the vocational rehabilitation specialist. All of them opined for 100% total disability by adding versus combining the impairments. And the judge took these opinions, these 4 consensual opinions for 100% disability, and opined that indeed Mr. LeCount was 100% permanently disabled. And the judge invoked Labor Code 4662, which provides for permanent total disability in accordance with the facts, quote unquote, the facts. Now, there's several scenarios that can provide for 100% or total disability. Number one is loss of use of both eyes, or loss of vision is a 100% total disability. Also, loss of use of both hands, or loss of both hands, is a 100% disability. Well, Labor Code 4662 also provides for 100% total disability when the facts, based upon facts, when the facts support a conclusion for 100% disability. So what are those facts? Well, those facts vary from case to case, and in the LeCount case, the facts that the judge relied upon was that based on the opinions of 3 evaluators and 1 vocational rehabilitation specialist, all of them opined for 100% disability, even though the permanent impairment ratings combined, using the combined values chart, to only 80 to 90% permanent impairment. They opined that by adding those impairments, certainly the impairment rating would be well over 100%, which would justify a conclusion for Mr. LeCount to be 100% permanently disabled. So let's go over some of this analysis in the LeCount case. So the orthopedic AME, he provided an initial impairment rating. He provided for 27% for the lumbar spine, 4% for the left shoulder, 1% for the left wrist, and 20% for the right hip. And he ran those numbers through the combined values chart, and he came up with 46% whole person impairment. He provided a 3% pain add-on to come up with a 49% whole person impairment under the strict application of the AMA guides. This is specifically according to the scheduled rating under the AMA guides, which is considered to be prima facie evidence of the accuracy of the permanent impairment rating. Well, that wasn't all that the orthopedic AME had to say. The orthopedic AME then provided some alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman, including a new impairment rating for the cervical spine, increased rating for the lumbar spine, increased for the shoulder, increased for the hip. And when he added all of those up, those came to 120% whole person impairment simply for the orthopedic conditions. However, using the combined values chart, these amounted to only 80% whole person impairment. So you can see the significance of 41% of compressive effect of the combined values chart. So these are losses of numbers of whole person impairment that become extremely important to examinees up in these higher impairment ratings. So he concluded that 80% using the combined values chart was a conservative estimate under the strict application of the AMA guides of the examinee's orthopedic impairment. Well, then the orthopedic impairment, which began at 121% by adding the impairments, the orthopedic impairment then had to be combined with psychiatric and internal medicine impairments. So let's see what happened there. So the judge took all the impairment ratings and applied apportionment to all the ratings. So these ratings that we're going to talk about are after apportionment. These are the compensable ratings here. He found 80% for the orthopedic rating, 30% cardiovascular rating, 28% sleep disorder, 26% psychiatric, which if they were all added would certainly exceed 100% disability, thereby providing Mr. LeCount with an award of 100% or total disability. But according to the compressive effect of the combined values chart, the rating would only be 93%. And it's interesting to note that even someone, a complete quadriplegic like Christopher Reeve, would not qualify for 100% total disability through the use of the combined values chart. He would still come in somewhere only in the 90%, but certainly according to the facts, Christopher Reeve would qualify as 100% totally disabled. Certainly would qualify for that under Labor Code 4662 due to complete loss of use of the hands. Okay? But anyway, this became the basis for the judge to conclude that if the impairment ratings were added compared to using the combined values chart, which clearly there's evidence that each of these impairments have a synergistic effect on the other, that Mr. LeCount would certainly be 100% totally disabled, whereas under the combined values chart, it becomes almost impossible to qualify for a 100% disability. So let's follow the judge's reasoning in concluding that Mr. LeCount was 100% totally disabled. He stated that if the combined values chart of the applicable schedule were applied, the combined disability for this injury alone would be 93% permanent partial disability after apportionment to non-industrial causation. However, the combined values chart, just like the multiple disabilities table before it, artificially combines disabilities in order to prevent pyramiding of the disabilities that would result from simple addition of the disabilities, which would anomalously result in a disability in excess of 100% in a case like this one where Mr. LeCount actually had 164% disability. Therefore, the combined values chart and the multiple disabilities table have always been considered guides only. And he references some cases wherein the courts concluded that the combined values chart shall be a guide only. He goes on and he says, moreover, Mr. LeCount is found totally disabled in accordance with the facts under Labor Code Section 4662. Certainly, the judge's observations of the applicant, whom he found to be credible, appeared to be genuinely in severe pain and consistent with one who is permanently and totally disabled. Those observations are corroborated by the above noted opinions of Dr. Federer, which is the orthopedic AME, and by the agreed vocational evaluator in Exhibit W1. Moreover, as Dr. Federer noted, even a quadriplegic like Christopher Reeve would not be deemed 100% disabled under the AMA Guide's application of the combined values chart. Therefore, in light of the fact that the combined values chart is merely a guide, and there is sufficient evidence to support a finding of permanent total disability caused by this injury, which there would be if the disabilities were merely added. In other words, they would reach 164% if the disabilities were added, rather than combined, which combines to 93%. It is found that this injury caused permanent total disability even after apportionment to non-industrial causes. Okay, so very interesting. In this case, the judge considered that adding the disabilities uh, was consistent with the opinions of the medical evaluators that this particular examinee, Armand LeCount, was 100% disabled and could not return to the open labor market. So the judge found that when these permanent impairments were added, they added to greater than 120 and even as high as 160%, consistent with a person who's 100% totally disabled, even though the final impairment rating used in the combined values chart was only 93%. So the permanent impairment ratings of greater than 100% weren't the only facts that contributed to the conclusion that Mr. LeCount was 100% disabled, but it did contribute, and it established a precedent along with the Kite case for, in specific cases, for adding the permanent impairment ratings compared to simply combining them with the combined values chart. And the final summary on this case, the LeCount case, was as follows. The judge stated, contrary to the defendant's assertion, the workers' comp judge considered the findings of non-industrial apportionment and, nevertheless, even after apportionment, found the applicant to be permanently totally disabled even after apportionment. He did so by adding applicant's impairments rather than using the combined values chart, pursuant to the opinions of Dr. Federer that there is a synergistic effect to applicants' orthopedic injuries so that they should be added rather than combined, and the opinion of, I think this is the internal medicine QME, that even after apportionment with the internal medical industrial problems and whole person impairment, applicant would meet the threshold for total disability. Alternatively, so those two opinions of adding the impairments and a synergistic effect contributed to the judge's conclusion that Mr. LeCount was 100% totally disabled, but alternatively, the judge found applicant permanently totally disabled in accordance with the facts, pursuant to section 4662, and they concluded that we find no reason to disturb the workers' comp judge's findings in this regard, and the opinion for 100% total disability, partially based upon adding impairments versus combining impairments, was upheld by the appeals board. Okay, so very interesting stuff, and we'll just emphasize this point by illustrating it through another similar case, which is the Miller versus Strohr and Graf case. Okay, so with the Miller case, Mr. Miller suffered a terrible injury. It was described, I believe, as a catastrophic injury, where he fell into an open ditch or a manhole. I believe it was a manhole with an open cover. Anyway, he suffered left tibial plateau fracture with non-union. So that's in the area of the knee, the tibial plateau. He suffered injury to the cervical spine, which necessitated surgery. Injury to the lumbar spine. He had a right 11th rib fracture. Injury to the left hip, the left great toe, and an injury to the psyche. He had multiple surgeries on the cervical spine and on the knee. He was evaluated by two AMEs, one in orthopedics and also one in psychiatry. So interestingly, the parties agreed on both the orthopedic and the psychiatric impairments. Neither of the parties had any disagreement with the final impairment rating of the orthopedist or with the final impairment rating of the psychiatrist, but the defendant disagreed on adding the impairments versus combining the impairments. So this case came to the appeals board to be reconsidered after the workers' compensation judge agreed that the orthopedic and psychiatric impairments could be added versus combined. So here are the cases at the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board, and the Appeals Board judges are referencing the opinion of the Workers' Compensation judge, the earlier opinion of the Workers' Compensation judge. So here they quote from the opinion. They say that Dr. Lieberman which was the psychiatric AME, stated 3 times that adding the psychiatric disability to the combined orthopedic injuries would give a more accurate rating than simply combining the psychiatric disability with the orthopedic disability or the impairment. So Dr. Lieberman is going to make a case that the psychiatric disability has a synergistic impact or contributes to the orthopedic impairment, and for that reason, the psychiatric impairment should be added versus combined with the orthopedic impairment rating. So the AME stated in his final report that he had authored 2 supplemental reports in which he opined that the combined values chart would not be the most accurate method of expressing Mr. Miller's residual disability. In his last report, he stated for the 3rd time that an additive approach of the psychiatric disability to the combined orthopedic disability would be more likely to be accurate to assess the patient's true residual disability for all factors. So it's interesting, the orthopedic evaluator found multiple orthopedic impairments, but he used the combined values chart to combine those impairments. But for the separate body regions and separate body systems, this evaluator, Dr. Lieberman, is suggesting that the impairments be added. He states that there clearly is evidence suggested in this history of a synergistic effect with respect to the psychiatric and orthopedic impairments, which unfortunately have warranted this approach of adding the impairments versus combining the impairments. In his May 2014 report, he reiterated what he had said in his earlier 2014 report, affirming that because of the synergistic approach of the psych and orthopedic injuries, an additive approach to the residual disability would probably be closer to the truth. And the appeals board tells us that the Kite case, which we just reviewed, is the only case that has any precedential value on this issue. So the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board is going to use the results of the Kite case to help them opine on this current Miller case. So Dr. Lieberman, the psychiatric evaluator, is going to make a case that there's a synergistic effect of the psychiatric impairment upon the orthopedic impairment. And he states it here. He states, Dr. Lieberman describes in detail the difficulty Mr. Miller was having with the treating physician's tapering of medication for the orthopedic condition. Okay, so think of this. Mr. Miller is going through medical treatment with the medical orthopedist for orthopedic condition, and the orthopedic physician is tapering down Mr. Miller's usage or provision of medication. This causes Mr. Miller great psychiatric distress, for which Dr. Lieberman strongly recommended integrated psychotherapy, that Mr. Miller have psychotherapy integrated with his treatment for the medical orthopedic condition. Dr. Lieberman comments that without this integrated psychotherapy, there will likely be a continuing considerable instability. He reminds the parties that he already affirmed the use of the additive approach in his May 2014 report because the claims administrator had a failure to provide the appropriate integrative approach. So Dr. Lieberman feels that he recommended integrated psychotherapy to help Mr. Miller deal with the tapering down of medications. This integrative psychotherapy was denied by the claims administrator's either utilization review or whatever. We don't know. We don't have those details. But for that reason, he felt that the psychiatric impairment was contributed to by the orthopedic impairment, and that actually makes a lot of sense. The opinion repeatedly expressed by Dr. Lieberman that the additive approach would more accurately reflect Mr. Miller's overall disability because of the lack of an integrative psychotherapy approach to his psychiatric and orthopedic impairments, is well reasoned and constitutes substantial evidence, especially when his initial report, read together with his 3 supplemental reports, all said the same thing, that he felt that the additive approach would be a more accurate description of the examinee's final impairment rating. So throughout these 3 cases, the Kite case, the LeCount case, and the Miller case, the critical component was that the multiple impairments had synergistic effects on the other impairments. So I want to ask you to start thinking in terms of whether or not you think that your examinee's multiple impairments, and we're talking about especially impairments in different body regions, I want you to think as to whether or not those impairments are contributing to or have a synergistic effect with any of the other impairments. If that seems to be the case, if there's a failure of one impairment to be able to compensate in the presence of another impairment, then it's possible that the final impairment rating, when you total it all up, could be more accurately described by simple addition than through the use of the combined values chart. Now, of course, when you do this, the defense is going to have something to say about it. So if you have a case that you decide to add the impairments versus combining the impairments, especially when the impairments approach the higher impairment ratings, it's going to make a significant impact on the examinee's final permanent disability rating. And this is going to get the attention of the defense attorney and also of the claims administrator. And I want to read from you a recent cover letter that I received from a defense attorney after being urged by the applicant attorney to provide an addition of impairments versus the combining of impairments. So let me rephrase that. After I provided a permanent impairment report, the applicant attorney wrote me back and said, would it be possible that adding impairments would be more accurate than simply combining the impairments? And then the defense attorney wrote me back, adding in his 2 cents in an attempt to influence the opinion of my supplemental report. And I'll read to you what he said. He says, first, you should know that all 3 cases, that is the Kite case, the LeCount case, and the Miller case, are based on 3-judge panel decisions of the WCAB. The decisions in these particular cases have absolutely no precedential or binding authority on the workers' compensation judiciary or community beyond the particular parties in those individual cases. Only decisions rendered by the full panel of judges sitting quote-unquote en banc, meaning only en banc decisions, are binding on the workers' compensation judiciary and community. So whereas cases like the Alvarez and Guzman cases, those are en banc decisions, those are binding cases. These cases, this defense attorney is arguing, the Kite and LeCount cases, are not binding cases. And so different judges in different jurisdictions could interpret those differently and could rely on those cases differently when it comes to making decisions about adding versus combining impairments. The defense attorney goes on to say, he says, the Kite and LeCount cases are what are known as writ-denied cases. In a writ-denied case, one of the parties to the panel decision, usually the defense attorney, filed a petition for a writ of review to the Court of Appeal. A writ-denied decision, in other words, when the case becomes writ-denied, a writ-denied decision in the context of these cases simply means that the Court of Appeals didn't review the cases as a whole or write an opinion. It merely denied the petition for the review. So that's what a writ-denied case is. Its denial, the denial of the writ, stands as the final decision of the WCAB panel in that case, but this is not binding on the workers' compensation judiciary or community beyond the particular parties in those individual cases. And he goes on to say these cases do not compel you to add versus combine the impairments you found in Mrs. Jones' cervical and lumbar spines and right and left shoulders. So the defense is going to have some words to say about this, so be prepared to well defend your opinion for a synergistic effect of those impairments if you decide to add versus combine the impairments.
So doctors, isn't that fascinating? Isn't that a fascinating discussion? You can see that under Alvarez and Guzman, the potential for permanent impairment ratings to escalate is seemingly an exponential function. Meaning, let's say, for example, you have a permanent impairment rating of the cervical spine and another permanent impairment rating for another body part, such as a left wrist, for example, and you employ analogies and alternative impairment ratings for each of those body regions that elevate the permanent impairment rating for each region. The combined elevation under the alternative impairment ratings is significant. And then if you add in the possibility that one impairment could have a synergistic effect on the other impairment, and then you employ the addition of impairments versus the compressive effect of the combining impairments under the combined values chart, can you see that these permanent impairment ratings can very quickly escalate? They can double, triple, quadruple, and we've had examples of those, including the example of Mr. LeCount, who was determined to be 100% permanently disabled, whereas an examinee like Christopher Reeves, under the strict application of the AMA guides, would not qualify for 100% permanent disability. And Mr. LeCount, although he was in rough shape, was certainly a lot better able to function in activities of daily living than Christopher Reeve. So these analogies and these alternative impairments under Alvarez and Guzman, including the adding of impairments versus combining impairments, can have a significant impact for the examinee and also for the parties involved in the case. So anytime you use an alternative impairment rating, such as adding impairments versus combining them, you must explain your reasoning as to how and why excellently. If you're able to excellently explain why an additive approach to the final permanent impairments is more accurate than a combining approach, then your opinion, even though these cases are not precedential, your opinion will likely be upheld. It will likely qualify as substantial medical evidence, and the judge will likely uphold it. If you're not able to substantiate your reasoning why, it'll become quickly apparent to the parties that you're simply trying to achieve a better result, and the opinion will be denied. So doctors, I hope this helps you in your arsenal of options for providing for permanent impairment for your examinees. There certainly is no limit to the types of alternative impairment ratings that can be found within the four corners of the AMA guides, and adding the impairments versus combining the impairments takes the omnipotent power of the QME to a whole new level. So I hope this helps you, and I hope you can employ some of these ideas in your upcoming evaluations. In our next session, we're going to conclude this series with a brief synopsis of some of the other additional ways that you can provide for alternative impairment ratings within the four corners of the AMA guides, including analogies to grip loss, including analogies to loss of lifting capacity, and then I have a couple of surprise analogies for you as well. So for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter wishing you best success in your career as a qualified medical